Moving on to the controllers, I've used both of these quite heavily, and there's absolutely no comparison. The PS5's DualSense controller just obliterates the Xbox controller. First, the DualSense has some absolutely incredible haptics. The Xbox controller just vibrates, but a PS5 controller gives you actual haptic feedback. So this is very similar to how on Android phones you have haptic feedback for when you're typing, but on the really cheap ones you can hear the vibration motor rattle inside your phone, and the experience is just horrible. But once you get to more high-end ones, the haptic feedback literally gives you the impression that you're pressing actual keys on the display. And it's literally the same thing with the Xbox and the PS5 controller. The best place that you can test this is in Astro's Playroom, which is a free game that comes pre-installed with your PS5. And the haptics are so good that you can feel individual droplets of rain hitting your fingers. Spider-Man Miles Morales does kinda use it to the point where you can kinda feel the punches, but nothing to the extent of Astro's Playroom. Now, the second reason why the PS5's controller is miles better is when it comes to the triggers. So while the Xbox controller does give you vibration feedback inside the triggers, the PS5 controller also has adaptive triggers, meaning that in some games the triggers will have different tension levels, and this surprisingly does work in more games than I expected. It works in Astro's Playroom, of course, but also in Spider-Man when you're swinging across New York City, in Black Ops Cold War when you're shooting a gun, and yes, each gun will have a different trigger feel. In Hitman 3, you can feel the tension before you're about to throw a coin or fire a weapon. A lot more games support the adaptive triggers than the haptic feedback, which I found quite interesting. Then third, the PS5 controller also has a built-in speaker, which you might think is pretty useless, but as a matter of fact, it actually adds to the immersion, as you don't necessarily hear the same sound as on your TV, but instead you only hear the sound effects. In Astro's Playroom, for example, you can hear how the droplets of water hit your finger, and then you can also feel them thanks to the haptic feedback. All of that is coming from the controller itself, whereas on the TV, you will hear the storm and the rest of the game music. Also, if you're in a party, you can hear the voice chat through the controller, and you can even respond because yes, number 4, the PS5 controller also has a microphone, which the Xbox lacks. By the way, you can disable this via the mute button if you want. Then number 5, the PS5 controller also has a touchpad, which some games do actually take really good advantage of, and for the ones that don't, it actually acts as a menu button as the touchpad is fully pressable. The Xbox controller has none of that. Number 6, the build quality. Remember how I said that the PS5 feels cheap when compared to the Xbox? Well, this is actually the opposite when it comes to controller. The Xbox controller feels to me like cheaper plastic and less refined overall when compared to the PS5 controller. However, there are 2 advantages that the Xbox controller does have over the PS5, and the first one is actually comfortability. So while I do find the PS5 controller to be far more comfortable than the PS4 one, it is a bit too big for my hands and just a bit too fat. The Xbox controller fits my palms perfectly, so I do find it more comfortable because of that. And second, the Xbox controller doesn't have a built-in rechargeable battery like the PS5 controller does, which is actually a downgrade, but in one way, it is actually an upgrade. For example, I'm actually using my old Apple rechargeable batteries. I always have 2 on the charger and 2 in my Xbox controller, and when the controller dies, I simply swap them out, and there you go, in seconds, I am ready to go. With a PS5 controller, if I don't have a spare controller, I have to plug it into a wall charger that's close to my sofa to be able to continue playing. Now, you do have to buy a rechargeable battery separately for the Xbox controller, but you can also buy Microsoft's own kit, but that one costs £38 in the UK, which is almost the entire price of a brand new Xbox controller in itself. But anyway, overall, the PS5 controller is just light years ahead of the Xbox controller. However, there have been some reported issues with the DualSense controller in terms of stick drift, which you might have heard about. Apparently Sony used the exact same joystick manufacturer as Nintendo, who also had some pretty big stick drift issues with the Nintendo Switch. There's even a class action lawsuit against Sony on this. Even Josh from our team had some pretty severe stick drift issues on his own controller, so I can confirm that we've had it here too. I personally haven't on my own PS5 controller, but it is definitely something that you should be aware of.